Hello there, and welcome back to the channel. Mad Mike here, and today we're going to be discussing something that's going to be a continuing series of videos, kind of like the Will It Fail videos, and it's basically my commentaries on directors that either I enjoy or that I have love-hate relationships with, kind of like the James Cameron video, which that's going to be the first video in this series, and this will be the second one. And just a warning to anybody that is squeamish. This video's topic is going to be the director David Cronenberg. And for those people who don't know who David Cronenberg is, he is the epitome of a body horror film director. And once I start going through his filmography, you'll understand that. I very much enjoy his films. I'm not somebody who has a weak stomach, so generally I can take his films for the messages that they give and just enjoying the practical special effects that he uses. So I'm going to go through several stages of his career, and there's really three. And the first one is going to be his career, which started in the 70s, and I'm going to go over first his very first major directorial film, which was Shivers, that he directed in 1975. Now, Shivers is a film that you can see the beginnings of what would become basically what we know Cronenberg as today, which is the body horror. And essentially the movie's about a parasite that it enters through people's mouths and causes them to do all these insane, heinous things, and then it spreads like a virus and so on and so forth. But the film is extremely graphic with some of the things that it shows. And it's actually even surprising for work in the 70s, even though it doesn't take the body horror disgust level to the extreme like some of his later works would do. I think Shivers is definitely a film that if you haven't seen it, I think you should check it out, because it does show you where Cronenberg started, and you can see where he's going to go from there. And again, it does have some pretty disgusting moments in it, so I will say that if you have a weak stomach, I don't think you should be watching it. And then I'm going to kind of just glaze over his second film, which is Rabid. And the only thing I'll say about Rabid is it's a zombie film. It's about a woman who gets plastic surgery and something goes wrong, and she starts trying to eat people, and those people turn into zombies and so on and so forth. But the only thing that I will note about it is it came out in 1977, which was a year before George A. Romero released Dawn of the Dead. So it kind of was a precursor to that, but it's not really remembered very well, because I think in a lot of ways Romero did his film better, and I think it caught on a lot more. So Rabid's kind of one of those forgotten films. I wouldn't say don't watch it, but I would say that it doesn't really show us too much new stuff from Cronenberg, other than he's delving a little deeper into the body horror aspect with the zombie look and all that stuff. Even though he really wouldn't dive into that very much later in terms of some of the stuff that he was doing. And the last film that I'll try to go over with a little bit more depth is The Brood. And The Brood is one of my favorite films by David Cronenberg. And it is just, if you've never seen The Brood, the ending of that movie will freak you the hell out if you've never seen it. And it has some great acting. Samantha Hagar, who plays the mother in the movie, is extremely good. It does something which was kind of popular in the late 70s, early 80s, which was putting children in danger. I know The Shining did that a year later. But basically the story is about a couple who have issues. The mother has mental issues, and she's being treated by a psychologist who tries to meld the physical and mental aspects of his patients together, which results in some very strange visuals. Let's just say that. But again, it's a movie that I would advise that you watch. I don't want to give away the ending of it, because the ending of it is amazing. But again, this is where we start to see Cronenberg go into his full body horror type of films, and we would see it again exacerbated in his follow-up films in the early to mid 80s. But The Brood itself, as its own thing, is just it's a complete roller coaster ride of just crazy. Because you have this whole mystery situation. People are getting murdered. Nobody knows exactly what the hell's going on. There are these little pygmy people running around, killing people. It's very, very bizarre for a film, and it's surprisingly brutal, especially in the death scenes. For certain characters, one of the early ones is somebody getting bludgeoned to death, I believe, with a meat mallet. But again, it's a horror movie, and it does what it's supposed to do. But this is kind of where Cronenberg gets his Connoisseur of Disgust title. And moving on from The Brood, we then go to one of his more classics. And this one isn't so much a horror film as it is just a very good science fiction film. That is Scanners. And of course, in Scanners, you have the amazing performance of Michael Ironside as the main antagonist. And honestly, this movie, the beginning of this movie, sets the tone for the entire thing. And the only unfortunate part about the very beginning of this movie is that it really doesn't get topped during the remainder of the film. You never really essentially get back to that point of like, what the hell. But essentially it's a movie about people that can control other people's minds, and they have like telekinetic abilities and stuff like that. And it's a very, very interesting film. It's more of a mystery film, and it showcases amazing practical effects. And again, Cronenberg uses that to his advantage. But you would see that he's also getting a bit more well-known actors. Michael Ironside, who, even though at the time I don't think he was as well-known as he was later on, he appeared in later films like Total Recall in 1990 and Starship Troopers in, I believe it was 97 or 96, one of those 2 years. And again, it's just a film that you can see his progression, where he leans on the special effects to provide you with the euphemisms of what these people are doing with their brains. And they have some very, very great special effects, especially on Michael Ironside and some of the other main characters of the film, where you just see like the veins and things popping out of their heads when they're trying to do all this stuff, and his eyes rolling back in his head. Very, very good visuals. And again, that's Cronenberg's strength, is just the visuals and what he is going to show you. And he doesn't give a single crap if you are disgusted by what he shows you. And I think that's very evident from the films. And past Scanners, he goes right back into the horror genre with another instant classic, Videodrome. Now, Videodrome is a movie, stars James Woods. And it's really it's kind of like Dawn of the Dead in the sense that it has a social message of like, your parents always used to tell you when you were a kid, television will rot your brain. In this, television warps your brain and warps your sense of reality. And it's really not so much a body horror film so much as it is an exploration of what James Woods' character thinks is real or not. As the film goes on, because you can tell that he's becoming more and more mentally unstable as the film goes on, and it gets progressively stranger and stranger and stranger. There's a very good scene in the film where he actually has it's obviously a prosthetic hand, but he has these nodes that come out of this gun that's in his hand, and it goes through his palm and weaves its way through his arm, going in and out of his skin. And it's extremely messed up to watch, because it does legitimately look somewhat real, and that's all due to the special effects artist. But this is kind of, I guess, what the first movie that I would say that Cronenberg made that has a kind of clear message. It wasn't just meant to be something horrifying, maybe other than The Brood, because The Brood does have a bit of a horrifying message involving motherhood and maternity. But again, that's something that he would revisit later on with The Fly. But going into Videodrome, it's just one of those films that it's very, very strange and surreal to watch that movie, and especially when you get to the end of it, it's you've been on the ride essentially. And then when you get to the end, you kind of ask yourself, what the hell did I just watch? But not in a bad way. Then you have Cronenberg's take on a Stephen King story, which again a lot of horror directors in the 70s and 80s did. You saw that with Stanley Kubrick in The Shining. But David Cronenberg took on The Dead Zone. Now, this is probably his least graphic movie. But at the same time, I find this movie to be one of his most entertaining, mainly because Christopher Walken plays the lead. And Martin Sheen plays a politician later on, and I can't remember. Tom Skerritt plays a town sheriff, and there's a good amount of talented supporting cast. But Christopher Walken really seals this movie, and Cronenberg does a very good job directing, especially some of the more gruesome scenes. And there is a one particularly gruesome scene in the film where somebody does kill themselves in a very horrifying and painful way. But it is absurdly messed up. But ultimately, Walken is the one that makes that film, I think, as good as it is. Even though Cronenberg's directing of him, I think, is extremely good as well. But The Dead Zone is just one of those movies where you can definitely tell it's kind of a surreal experience again, because Christopher Walken's character plays somebody who has developed premonition. So if he touches somebody, he can see their future, and that leads him down all these different random paths. And at the same time, his life is falling apart. He was in a coma for, I think in the movie they stated it was 15 years or something like that. But he was in a coma for a very long time, and he wakes out of it, and then his life has gone to hell. But he has this strange ability, so he decides to try and use it to help people. He helps the police, he saves some kids, but then by the end of the movie, it winds up undoing him. But again, The Dead Zone, I find a extremely entertaining movie, and one that a lot of people do not mention that Cronenberg directed. And I think that may be because of the strong special effects and body horror that he was known for at the time. You had The Brood, you had Scanners, you had Videodrome, you had The Fly, which he would do immediately after this. And a lot of people remember those movies because it has more of his trademark on it. Because that essentially body horror has almost become Cronenberg's trademark, or the idea that your body is betraying you. And it's a core fear of people. It's the idea of you look at your hand and you think like, the idea like, you have holes in your hand, or a deformity, or leprosy, or skin infection, or something like that. Something that where your skin and your flesh looks all messed up, or parts of your body, and that's inherently horrifying to human beings, where our bodies are failing us in horrific ways. And I can't remember the guy's name for the life of me, unfortunately, but there was a film critic who pointed this out, and it's the idea that the ideal is that the body is a temple. You worship the body, but in reality, the body is meat, and that's what Cronenberg looks at. Is the body essentially is just animated meat, and that meat can be sliced and diced and burned and seared and everything else done to it, and it doesn't really matter in terms of what you're doing to it, but it's the visceral reaction of people to that. And after saying that, let's go into The Fly. And The Fly is probably one of his most well-known works, and I mentioned this in my Hollywood remakes video as being one of my favorite remakes. And I probably would only put John Carpenter's The Thing above it in terms of how much I enjoy it. And a large part of that is Jeff Goldblum does a great job as Seth Brundle. Gina Davis does an amazing job alongside him. The two, I believe, were married during the filming of this, which again leads to a good amount in their chemistry. And I believe this was also their second or third film together. I don't know if this was... they did 3 films together. I believe this is the second of 3. So they had worked with each other in the past as well, even though they were in a relationship at the time. But ultimately, the believability of Jeff Goldblum becoming a fly, his body mannerisms, the twitching that you would associate with a fly, and the way that he starts to think, and the way that he starts to act and speak, it's horrifying to watch. And this is a movie that made people physically ill when they went to see it. This is a movie where I think it would have been appropriate for people to pass out barf bags back. I believe this was made in 1984, and the special effects again in this film are so far beyond anything that Cronenberg had done in the past. This outdoes everything, because the special effects that are used on Jeff Goldblum are amazing. And you can see the gradual progression of what's happening to him and the horror of it, and the idea that Cronenberg had to turn this into, as opposed to just swapping a few body parts and having two separate storylines going on, where there's Seth Brundle, his head and his arm are attached to a fly, and the fly head and arm are attached to his body. Instead, to turn into a gene splicing storyline and to make it so horrific in what's happening to him, and that there's no going back. It's not like the original story where, like, okay, maybe you can put him back in the chamber and you can get him back to normal if you send him back the other way. There's no. As soon as you figure out what's happened to him, that he's screwed, even though he's trying to fix it. And it's just the horror of the inevitability of what's going to happen. And again, I mentioned before that this also leans on Cronenberg's horror of childbirth, which leads to a very famous scene where Gina Davis gives birth to a fly larva in this film. And again, that's extremely graphic. But it's one of those movies you have to watch that movie if you enjoy any kind of if you enjoy horror films and you're not squeamish, you should watch this movie. And it is an amazing film, and I think this is Cronenberg's best film, period. And I think that after this point, his films did go downhill a little bit. I think that, again, I'm going to go over this. There were three phases to his filmography. His early stage, which I include Shivers, Rabid, and The Brood. Then you have his, what I referred to it in the James Cameron video, similar, is his golden age, which started with Scanners. Then you had Videodrome, The Dead Zone, and The Fly. And again, kind of like Cameron with The Abyss, The Dead Zone is kind of forgotten in that bunch, but I would lump it in there because I think it's an amazing film. But then you go into his more strange films that aren't as body horror-y, but still kind of, some of them are okay, but they're still kind of weird. And we're going to go into the first one, which is a really messed up movie that people forget about, and it's called Crash. There's another movie that came out that I believe it won the Academy Award for Best Picture in late 2000s, something like that. I think it was the year before the Hurt Locker one. I think it would have been like 2008 or something. But it's called Crash. Jane Spader is the star of it. Holly Hunter is in it as well. But it's a very strange movie where people get off to being in car accidents. And it's really messed up. And it's people that get turned on by getting into car accidents, and that's just all it really is. It's not, there's no like profound message, or at least there doesn't seem to be anyway for me. It's just sex and weird freaky sex and car accidents. So I mean, it's kind of disgusting in a bit of a way of like what they're portraying on screen, but so I'm going to kind of skip past that one a little bit because there's really not much to say about it other than, another Jane Spader role where he's having sex with a bunch of people. How did that guy dodge sex therapy, by the way? If David Duchovny had to go for Californication, how the hell? Jane Spader spent a decade doing that shit. So all right. So now that we're past James Spader's possible sex addiction, let's go to Existenz. And this one is very, very weird. Jude Law, very early role for Jude Law. And this movie I feel like this was Cronenberg trying to be a little too cute with what he was doing. Existenz is basically a movie about these people who they go into this game in virtual reality where they plug like this pulsating skin sack into their back, into like a hole in their back, and then they decide that they're going to play this strange like online game. It feels a lot, actually, a little bit like an anime called Sword Art Online. It feels kind of like that, except it's really, really strange. And the whole time they're trying to do like a Total Recall type of thing where you don't know what's reality and what isn't, and it kind of shifts back and forth and like, oh, are we in the game? Are we not in the game? And then at the end they have a moment where like, oh, maybe they're in the game, maybe they're not. It's supposed to be ambiguous, but it really doesn't work very well. It's a very clunky script. And the action in it again is very clunky. It's very very strange. That is one. I think that might be the only movie on this list besides Crash that I would recommend that you probably could skip. If you want to watch it just for the novelty of it, then feel free. But that what I would consider Crash and Existenz his low points. And then we have his last really big production, which was, strangely enough, it was a movie called A History of Violence. I don't know if many people remember this movie with Viggo Mortensen, and that one is actually a fairly interesting movie. And surprisingly, it's actually based off of a comic book, and a lot of people don't know that. But I felt it was outside of his wheelhouse essentially. He doesn't really do movies about crime necessarily, and stuff like that. Again, his stuff is more surreal for the most part. Especially with the body horror aspect. This really doesn't have any body horror stuff in it. It's just more of a straightforward story. And it's very, very interesting to see him try to take on something that it was very far outside of what his wheelhouse was. Because again, this is not a horror movie. If anything, it's a thriller, and it's very, very interesting. I would recommend A History of Violence just to watch the narrative of it. And I don't want to give too much away in this. But Viggo Mortensen does a very good job in the lead, I can't remember who plays his wife in the film, but again, it's very very well acted. And this is Viggo Mortensen, I believe, before the Lord of the Rings trilogy, so this was like late '90s. But I would consider those three movies, those last three, to be kind of the downward spiral of the if we're looking at a bell curve, it goes up and up and up, and then you hit the fly, and then it goes down, 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 down. So that would be where I would consider it. But '80s Cronenberg is by far the best Cronenberg. That was his golden age from Scanners, or really probably from The Brood in 1979 all the way up through The Fly in 1984. And I think you really need to look at that because it again, that stretch of 5 films just epitomizes the body horror genre, the subgenre. Which again, you've had some notable contributors to it. John Carpenter, who did The Thing, great body horror movie, amazing body horror movie. And nowadays, obviously, you have the cheaper knockoffs. You have the Human Centipedes, or you have Kevin Smith did a ripoff of that called Tusk, which is god awful. And there's been a few other ones over time that have popped up. But again, that's my opinion on David Cronenberg. He's one of my favorite horror directors. To be honest, I'd put him at number 3 behind Carpenter and Wes Craven. But tell me what you think. Do you agree with my opinions on some of these movies? Put it in the comments below. Make sure to hit the like button and hit the bell for notifications. And remember, I live my life free of compromise. Do you?